In this video, I'm building the spawning pools found in the 6th edition Lizardmen codex, and then, finally completing one of the oldest models in my collection to go along with it. I'm using XPS foam as my material of choice and cutting it down on my hot wire table. The construction of these pools is quite simple and can be done with a sharp utility knife as an alternative option. The majority of this terrain piece is constructed with these large bricks with thinner slabs on top. I want to make sure the pools look like they're made out of stone, so I toss all the pieces into a container of rocks and give it a good shake. This takes the sharpness off the edges of the foam and makes them look like stone. I'm using wood glue to stick all the pieces together. The bottom portion of the pool is made up of a single layer of these larger stones. I then place these thinner slabs on top, making sure that they're centered over the joint of the larger stones below. Building like this will add a bunch of durability to the piece. Next, I measure the pool to get the dimensions of the bottom. This piece is then cut to size and textured. Here you can see me attaching the bottom piece. I'm not too worried about the gaps at this point since I'll be filling them in later. I changed up the build process on my second spawning pool, placing the stones directly around the floor piece rather than gluing it on afterwards. I created the iconic Lizardmen totems on my computer and then printed out a template. There's going to be one of these on each of the corners. The paper is blue tacked to a chunk of foam and then slowly cut out on the hot wire table. At a lower heat, the hot wire isn't strong enough to burn through the paper, so it works well as a temporary template. Cutting these pieces in half creates the perfect thickness. I'm using an X-Acto knife to make all the edges uneven. The length and depth of these cuts is randomized to create an organic texture. Rolled up tin foil is used to texture the flat side of these pieces. The totems are then attached to the spawning pool corners using wood glue. I plan on doing a resin pour, so I'm using spackle to fill all the gaps on the bottom of the pools. I'm also squeezing glue along the top edges of the floor to ensure no resin spills out. The pools are then set aside and left to dry. In the meantime, I get started on the second part of this project, finishing this pewter Lizardmen Stegadon. Thankfully, this model was packaged away safely and no pieces ever went missing. I remember this model being a bit overwhelming to build when I first got it. These larger metal models require a bit more hobbying experience to put together compared to the plastic kits. This is probably what led to it sitting around unfinished for all these years. As soon as I decided to build the spawning pools, I thought this would be the perfect opportunity to finally finish this model. Putting together this kit and creating matching terrain from scratch really felt like an old school hobby session. All the pieces of the model get primed black using an airbrush. I then get started painting. For the color scheme, I decided to stay true to the box art. So, some backstory about my Lizardmen models. I started collecting them as a side project, but they never ended up getting completed and becoming a playable army. My friends and I played a bunch of 40k at the time, and we wanted to try something new, so we decided to pick up Warhammer Fantasy as an alternative game. I chose the Lizardmen because I liked their model range at the time. The majority of the Stegadon is dry brushed, building up the layers of color one by one. Afterwards, I go back in with my brush to edge highlight the most raised areas. This was quite an enjoyable model to put together and paint. For the base, I knew I wanted to finish it off with a classic goblin green rim for that proper vintage Warhammer look. I didn't think I'd ever get around to finishing this model, so it's great to see it finally built and painted. Time to jump back to the spawning pools and get them painted up. I start off by giving everything a black base coat. I then mix together some grays and overbrush on the stone color. I'm making sure my brush isn't oversaturated with paint. That way when I apply the color, the deepest recesses are left black. This creates an interesting stone look with a lot of contrast. I'm also making sure there's a bit of green mixed in with my gray, so it looks more realistic. Natural stone is rarely 100% gray and usually contains some sort of color in its undertones. Next, I'm applying glue in select locations. I then apply some flock in those spots. I realized this wasn't in the original codex artwork, but I couldn't help it. I think the greenery adds some much needed contrast. I'm also using this vine foliage for some vertical coverage on the totems. Once I'm happy with everything, I seal it all in place with a coat of glue. I'm using my airbrush to apply a green hue to the bottom of the stones, and also any area where there's foliage. This creates a nice transition between the stone and the greenery, and also adds variation to the foliage color. Next, I mix up a cup of resin to be used as the water within the pools. While doing research for this project, I learned that the lizardmen do not give birth in the conventional sense. Instead, they emerge fully formed from these magical spawning pools. Generations that have spawned together use the term brothers from the same water, which I find really funny. Once poured, I let the resin sit to dry for 24 hours. And here's the finished piece. I had a good time with this project and was glad to finally finish one of the oldest models in my collection after all these years. It was also fun to build this matching terrain piece from the codex. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to hit the like button, leave a comment, and subscribe for future hobby content. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.